Hello, it's Cara Riley with the Landscape Photography Show. We're here with episode number 19, Understanding HDR Photography. This is going to be an amazing show. We're going to have the Tom and Kevin show tonight. Both are curators on the landscape photography theme. And so we'll just all introduce ourselves and we'll get right to the show at hand. And we want to thank absolutely everyone who's been participating in our events with sharing your photography. It is incredible this week. And once we introduce everyone who's here, then we'll be showing our show starters. So we'll get right to our hellos here with I'm Cara Riley with the Photo Tour Global Director, and then we'll get to Margaret in Kansas City, our illustrious leader.
Hi everyone, I'm Margaret Tompkins here in Kansas City. I'm retired and an amateur photographer, and I just love looking at landscape photographs. So I enjoy the theme and I enjoy this show, and I'm just super pleased that we're able to do some HDR tonight, something I really want to learn.
Great. Now we'll jump over here to Tom in Carmel, California.
Hi, I'm Tom Hurl, and as Cara said, I live in Carmel, California. And although I've volunteered to talk about HDR based on some of these pictures that have been submitted this week, I think somebody else should be talking tonight. We got some very good submittals.
That's great, thank you. Now we're going to go all the way over to the other end in Arizona with Jim Worthman.
Hi everybody, I'm Jim Worthman, an amateur enthusiast photographer, and like Cara said, based in Phoenix, and love to do black and white and color landscapes. I'm really interested to hear Tom and Kevin tonight because I haven't done a whole lot of HDR, so tonight should be a good chance to learn some things.
That's great. And we've got Kevin Rowe. Kevin in Utah.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Rowe, and I live in South Jordan, Utah, which is in the Salt Lake Valley. And my favorite thing is to go out with my camera gear and go on hikes and get pictures of all the mountains and waterfalls and streams. And I love to come back here and share them with all of you, and I love seeing all your photos. So thank you.
Well, that's great. Well, we, again, saying thank you to everyone in the event, and this is a fun part of our show where we're going to share 5 show starters, which were selected from the photos that were submitted to our event. And if you haven't gone to the gallery, I would highly suggest that you go to the gallery, because people like Tom had mentioned, who are very talented in HDR, have actually shared how they processed some of their work. So Tom's got, or Kevin's got this all up. I'm in a blue box over here, and we'll start right off.
Yeah, and this first share is for Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Tom, you want to share about this this photograph? And I think that's that famous Australian bridge.
Oh, it certainly is, and I really like the reflection and the colors that Renee Kisselbach got in this, and this one really caught my eye, so I picked it as the starter for this week.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And Cara.
Okay, I can't see on mine. Oh, there we go. This is Randy, and if some of you do Sky Sunday, then you know who Randy Schirkenbach is, and was on our show for the Google Plus 2-year anniversary walk. But this just had some amazing light and some amazing lines, and really appreciate it, Randy, and appreciate you supporting the events and sharing your lovely work.
Okay, and Margaret.
This photo is from Dave Tomick in Australia, And he's just a marvelous photographer, and this one just so draws me in. I love the water, I love the colors, I love those piers. It's like I'm really into this photograph. It's amazing work, and just a real show starter here.
Yeah, Margaret, and I also wanted to point out that you were the early bird because I think about 4 of us wanted to pick this photo, so this one's awesome. So this one was my choice.
Thanks so much to Dave because he's really answered absolutely so many questions. And we have so many people from Australia we were trying to accommodate for live, and at some point maybe we will. But thank you guys for your support. It's wonderful. Are we ready for the next one?
Kevin.
Kevin had a gremlin.
Lost Kevin.
So he'll be back. Sometimes when we're screen sharing, I've found that it just gets stuck. The screen share gets stuck. So Kevin, you have to close out and come back if you're frozen there on time. So let's see. You know, Jim, you could just go ahead and share who you had for a show starter.
Without the photo, yeah. And so the show starter that I chose was from Tony Hayward. And if you were seeing the photo, it's really an unusual HDR, very natural looking. You'll see it later, I'm sure. But the HDR was used to bring out some extra foreground detail, but it's still a very misty, frankly low contrast photo overall, which is unusual.
So, okay, great. And I know that the 5th show starter, and when Kevin gets back, we'll be able to see them, but was Shawn Hudson. And so if you go to the gallery, you'll be able to see all of these great shows, or these great photos. Now, we also have, this is our first time, so you know, guaranteed Google Gremlins will show up, but we do have the open question. So if you have a question, then you'll be able to you'll be able to submit any of your questions. But as we have done in the past, you can also just put a comment in the event itself, and it's showing up. And Russ Scullin is telling us, yes, I'm getting the same thing, Kevin Rose. Some of us are getting a black screen. So, well, we will hope that you're not getting a black screen. Russ, let us know if you're still okay, because it seems to be rolling on this end, but we don't know what you're seeing. So we'll just...
Voight also is saying he's got a black screen, so there are 2 folks.
Seeing a black screen?
Let's go ahead with Tom's, and maybe Kevin can get back with us here.
Okay, all right. So let me just go ahead and tell you what we'll be covering in the show tonight. And this is such a great learning opportunity. Margaret and I have been talking about this. Learn why and when to use HDR, how to capture images for HDR, and how to process the images. And there we go. We have Kevin back. When it freezes, that's all you can do, Kevin. We just keep on going.
Well, that was
go out and come back.
You know, I actually just had a power surge come through, and that power flicked on and off. So I hope that's the only one. And if it's during my portion, then I'll apologize. But
okay,
why don't I just share the rest of those after Tom?
Okay. Go right ahead here. Beach Bum Brian, thank you, Beach Bum Brian. Crystal clear in Hawaii. We appreciate that. So I think we're back on track. So are you going to show those real quick there, Kevin?
Yeah, I can if you want me to. I didn't know if Tom had already started or not.
No, he's
just getting teed up.
Okay. Yeah, let me get them up here then.
This is what you get with live YouTube, right? Gremlins and all.
Okay, so where did I cut out?
We have Shawn Hudson and Tony to show.
Okay. Give me 1 second here, and I'll.
Isn't that right? Or we hadn't shown Tony's, or had we? No,
No.
Jim just talked. We got Jim's face for Tony's shot.
Okay, here we go.
All
Okay,
right.
so this one is mine, and this is Shawn Hudson, and I really like all the elements in this. I love the way he put the sun right on one of those masks. That looks awesome, and it's a real good example of HDR, but not taking it too far. So I really like that one. And then let me pull up. Whoops. I guess that one closed. Sorry. Let me find. Let's see. It was Tony, right?
Yep.
And I'm not seeing that.
Let me get it real quick.
Well, we saw it. Oh, hi, Ray. We got Ray. We've got Steve Montaldo and Dave. Oh, John Glasser. We got a viewing audience here. So as soon as we get that put up, then we'll go forward.
Now,
Kevin,
Margaret, or Cara, did you mention the live comments? Have those been working?
Yes. And nobody is indicating. I'm seeing all the comments in the event. If one of you who's listening would tell us, is this looking different with the Q&A? Because this is Google just rolled this out last week where we have the live Q&A, and I didn't know if it was any different from what we had just on the event. And
Okay, sorry about that. That was acting a little strange.
okay.
All the beautiful HDR images that people have shared, though. That was great.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, here's the photo from Tony Hayward, and you know this, as I mentioned earlier, when you couldn't see the photo, you know this has just a misty, dreamy kind of feel to it, very natural HDR, and you can see it's fairly low contrast, even though it was processed with HDR, and it went off.
Great. Well, I think we're just going to go ahead and go right on over here to Tom. And Tom, we'll let you start us off. We've got a couple of questions. I'm just going to read them now, and then I think we'll probably be covering them. Richard Creamer asks, before blending, is it a good idea to push the lights and darks in each frame prior to blending, or a bad idea? So we'll hold that thought, Tom, because I'm sure you're probably covering that in your information, and then we'll just go forward. Tom, take it away.
Okay. First, an outline here. I'm going to explain a little bit about dynamic range and exactly what that is, just so people understand it. I know I want to start fairly simply tonight because I know a lot of people are new to HDR. Some of you more experienced people might be bored by this, but I apologize. But I'm going to start off just explaining dynamic range, explaining how the human eye has a much greater dynamic range than your camera, and so what we have to compensate with the photography to replicate what we see with our eye. HDR involves bracketing shots. I'm going to explain what bracketing is and why you want to do that, and then show some examples of shots that were taken that I've bracketed, and then combine them using HDR software to combine them to into one shot. Some basics on how to bracket, and also I'm going to talk a little bit about sometimes you just can't take multiple shots. Maybe what you're taking a picture of is moving quickly, and so you can actually create some virtual bracketing here using Lightroom, make some virtual copies, and process it as you would a regular HDR shot. And then to finalize, I'm going to talk about what not to do, because certainly there's some things in that area that you need to be aware of. All right. First thing, I just want to explain the concept of stops, or exposure value. It's I guess a logarithmic scale, and so when one talks about increasing something by 1 stop, that's a factor of 2. 2 stops is a factor of 4. 3 stops, factor of 8, and so on. So when we talk about dynamic range in terms of stops or exposure value, please remember it's logarithmic. I pulled this one showing what the light density of light, we cover all the way from nighttime scenes just by starlight all the way up to a bright sunny day. We want to take pictures over that range. Now that's 8 orders of magnitude, or 100 million times variations in the luminance density, and this is measured in candelas per square meter, but it's just a measurement of the light density, and that equals a total of 27 stops. And so there's a wide range of light intensity that we might come across in trying to take photographs. If I look at a typical outdoor scene, sunlit, middle of the day, there's maybe a 100,000 range, or 17 stops, between the brightest area that gets direct sunlight versus something that's maybe in the shade. As a comparison, the human eye, it's pretty good. It's good for about 14 stops, or roughly 10,000 to 1. So sometimes on these bright sunlit days, your eye adjusts to the bright sunlight, but if you want to make out something that's in the shade, under a bush or something, it all looks pretty dark. You have to get really close to see it. So the human eye is pretty good, but it has its limits in resolving your typical outdoor scene. A film camera, though, that's roughly 2,000 to 1, or 11 stops. It's not as good as the human eye at all. And then the digital camera, that's somewhat worse than the film camera. That's typically 8.5 to, some of the newer ones have gotten better. They're maybe 10 or 11 stops approaching film in terms of its ability to capture a dynamic range, but certainly far less than the human eye. And this is what we all struggle with, trying to replicate what we see with our human eye in terms of light and dark in a scene. And we get frustrated because in the camera it either shows up at all very dark and black, or on the other end, too light, and it's blowing out. So this is what we struggle with, and why we consider doing HDR, just to try to replicate what we see with our eye. And then your computer monitor is maybe good for 9 or 10 stops. Print paper is 7 or 8 stops, just to have some numbers there. Now, I also mentioned that the dynamic range is dependent on both the ISO speed and with sensors. And I happen to print this out. These are for 3 Nikon cameras, just because I have a D70 and a D700, and I know this is hard to see, probably because it prints small, and I apologize for that. The D70 is an older camera. It's maybe 6 or 7 years old by now. It's the numbers in red, and so at an ISO of 200, it's got a dynamic range of maybe 7 stops. The D700, which is now I guess 3 or 4 years old, is maybe good for 9 stops, and the D800, which is I guess the latest full frame sensor that Nikon makes, that's good for about 11 stops. So it's gotten much better. It's and remember, I think film was about 10 stops.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
When you say it has a range of 7 or 8 stops, does that mean that anything lighter or darker than that range would clip?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And what I wasn't aware of is how quickly it fell off as you push the ISO. And so if you're trying to do some low light scenes, it's easy to fall off by 3 or 4 stops in terms of your dynamic range. The good news is that the sensor manufacturers are getting better and better on building sensors that have higher dynamic range, so that's good. Now, if I look at my typical high contrast scene, and this might be outdoors at midday where it's a bright sunny day, my total light range might range over the 17 stops that we talked about. And with my human eye, with a 14 stop capability, I can capture the portion that's between the red bars. And but again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, in some of the darker areas under a bush or something, or looking right up towards the sun, I really can't resolve that with my eye just because it's too high a range. So as good as the eye is, the digital camera is limited. So if you look at the areas between the red and the green, those would be blown out or too dark on your digital image. And this is what we try to correct using HDR. Now here's an example of a normal contrast scene, and I encourage everyone that's considering HDR to use your histogram, because that'll tell you a lot about what the sensor is doing. In this case, you see the histogram on the right-hand side there, that pretty much it's all within the normal range of the sensor. There's no areas of black that you can't resolve, and you know, pretty much the white areas are all have detail in them. Nothing's really blowing out. So this would be your normal contrast range, and you don't necessarily need to do HDR in this to capture some of that. Next shot, though, this is a sunset shot, and this is just an extreme example where you have a very wide range, because you're taking a picture right into the sun. So obviously all around the sun the clouds are all blown out because it's very dark, and at the same time the detail on the wood and the dock, it's all in black just because it is so dark. And you can tell by the histogram, clearly you're running off either end of the histogram with both light and dark. You're not resolving properly. And so for this, you'd want to do an HDR shot just to try to bring out some of the detail both in the high and the low end of the range. So here we have the problem with high contrast scenes is you have a wide range of light. The camera has your 7 or 8 stops of capability, so that's the area between the green there. And you can see both in the dark area, the histogram, and the light area, the histogram, you're losing information, you're losing detail that just isn't coming out at all. So the way around that is you try to take some bracket exposures. Now, if you tell your camera to take your normal exposure, it'll adjust the exposure to give a medium shade of gray. So it'll average all the points it takes, and it varies on the type of camera you have, but its ultimate goal is to give you an average value. And in this case, I try to represent that by the green bars. And to try to capture more on the higher end and the lower end, you might want to have to compensate your exposure, bump it up 1 or 2 stops going up and 1 or 2 stops going down, and that way you capture more of the histogram. You have 3 different shots here, and if you combine the 3, you capture more of the histogram. Obviously the blue exposure, where it's reduced by 2 stops, maybe I have my plus and minuses reversed here. But anyway, you capture some of the lost area by using this bracketing, both going up or down. So I'm going to show some examples here. This is an example of the picture of the dock that was processed with HDR. And here you see there's more detail in the sky around the sun. It's not blowing out. And at the same time, you see the grain there. So this is what you want to use HDR for, the high contrast scenes. This is a shot that I took several weeks ago, and this is my standard exposure, and it's okay, but I was losing some detail in the fog. It was on the light hand side, it was a little bit too light. At the same time, in the rocks of the foreground, the dark rocks, I would have liked to brought out some more detail in the rocks themselves. So what I ended up doing was taking three exposures: a normal exposure, a second exposure where I compensated 1 stop down, and then another exposure where I pushed it up 1 stop. So you can see, compared to the normal, one's darker and one's brighter. And by combining all three of those in HDR software, I'm able to get the shot here where I get more detail in the clouds and the fog, and at the same time I bring out more detail in the rocks that were otherwise all seem to be very dark.
So, Tom, I have a question for, because I think that we have some viewers who have never taken an HDR shot, okay? And they're here to learn. So the question is, on your camera, those 3 shots that you took, does your camera know to take those 3 shots, or did you technically have to change the settings for those 3 shots?
Oh, well, let me explain then. It's a good lead into my next slide here, how to take bracketed shots.
Oh, great, great. Okay, good.
Okay. First point is I suggest using a tripod because you have 3 different shots, three or more shots. You can have up to 7 or 9 different exposures depending on how much you need to bracket. These examples I've just showed 3 for simplicity's sake, but you could certainly use more if you had a very high contrast scene. And so, as good as we think we try to be, holding your camera still for 3 or 5 or 7 successive shots is very difficult. Now, I've certainly done some handheld HDR, and the software tries to compensate for that by comparing the different frames and trying to line them all up, and that actually does a very good job of doing that. But I always believe if you can get it right in the camera, you're much better off instead of depending on the software trying to do it, because you're not always perfect with the software. So if you use the tripod, you have a much better chance of making the frames line up properly. The second point is you should use aperture priority, and when most cameras have the ability to set up for dupe brackets. It might vary from model to model. For example, with my Nikon cameras, I can go up to a maximum of one stop, but I can have a number of different variations. I can do 3 stops altogether, so -1, 0, and +1. I can do 5 stops, -2, -1, 0, +1, and +2. But when it does that, I set it up to do bracketing because I'm working in aperture priority. The exposure time is varying. And you want to do that because you don't want to be changing your depth of field. If you're working in speed priority, where the exposure time is held constant, your aperture would be changing, and you have slightly different depths of field, which would lead to odd things, I think, when you try to combine them. So you're much better off with aperture priority when you do this.
I have a question, Tom, here from
Sure.
Ray Billcliffe. He says, how many f-stops between each bracketed shot works best?
Well, Ray, I think it really depends on how wide of a dynamic range you have. Some of the shots where you're shooting sunsets and the sun is very bright and you have a dark foreground, you might want to be covering either do 5 or 7 one-stop variations, or if your camera allows, you can do 2-stop variations. You know, some cameras don't allow the automatic bracketing. You can only do 3 total pictures, but lets you take bigger steps. And I don't really know if there's an advantage for taking multiple smaller steps, or you get to the same place by taking fewer larger steps. I've never sat down and tried that. Just because with Nikons I'm limited to a maximum bracket step of 1 stop. That's what I use, and I either do 3 shots total, 5 shots total, or 7 shots total, depending on my, what sort of variation I'm seeing. And you can also be looking, as I mentioned earlier, the camera will try to expose for a medium gray type of range. And you might also combine your bracketing with an exposure compensation where you shift it. You maybe don't want -1, 0, and +1. You maybe want -2, -1, and 0 as your 3 shots. But I would encourage people to look at their histograms to see. Essentially, you want your range of shots, whether it's 3 shots or 5 shots, where if you combine them all, you're not hitting either the high end or the low end. you're capturing all the light data. You're not clipping at either end.
Tom,
Tom?
we have about 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and one other question, and we may not be able to answer this one, but how do you figure out the f-stop? I have an older Olympus in manual. It's hard to read. Kevin, you can weigh in on any of these, or
I have no idea. I'm not sure there's a way, but I would have to know what it is and research it. But,
here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to send you to Alex McClure. He is an Olympus trailblazer, and he can answer that question. So I'll answer and put his name into the answers there for you. Okay.
And Tom, I wanted to jump in with one thing, and we just got a comment that from Tori Voigt that's got exactly the same point, and that is when I shoot, I like to bracket a lot, and I've done count them, three HDRs. but I never use the auto bracket, and on a Canon, it's maybe a little weaker than it is on a Nikon. But I always shoot manual and watch the histogram, and like you say, just change the exposure from shot to shot, and I personally use one EV between each exposure, and shoot in manual, and just make sure that at one end I've covered all the darks. There's nothing, on the left side of the histogram up against the edge, and do the same thing on the other, and then make sure that I've got all the highlights off the edge, and that can take 4, 5, 7 shots to do that. I don't pay attention to the aperture at all. I don't change the aperture. Oh, I'm sorry. I do change the aperture. No. I don't change the aperture. I change the shutter speed, like you were saying. Yeah. But right. I do it just in manual instead of trying to use auto bracket.
And let me just jump in and tell you about how I would do it on the Canon and the Sony. On the Canon, I actually set it up to auto bracket. I go in and you can dial it on the Canons. You can dial it anywhere from 1 to 5, -5, but it'll only take 3 in automatic. So on the Canon, I would always use -2, even, and +2, and that seems to really capture most of the dynamic range for things. And when I'm doing landscapes, my favorite thing on the Canon to do was actually just put it in 2-second delay and push the button. You're on the tripod, your hand's away, and it just takes all 3 of your exposures for you after 2 seconds. On the Sony, it's pretty much the same thing. You can decide on 3 shots. So Nikon has an advantage there where they can do 5 and 7, but if you need more than that 3, then just do it manually, like Jim's saying. You just dial in exposure compensation.
Yeah, I will say with the Nikon that once you set up for your bracketing, you have to press your shutter each shot, so you have to be able to count to 3 or 5 or 7 to make sure you get them all. I think the Canon, you press it once and it takes all 3 shots. Bang, bang, bang.
Right.
All right, moving on here. My next point is to try to use a relatively low ISO setting, because I think most of the software tends to exaggerate the noise. And this is consistent if you're using a tripod anyway. You can get away with a little bit longer exposure if the light is somewhat marginal. You should be aware if you have movement in the frame, you might get some ghosting. So if you're trying to take a picture of something moving quickly, it's problematic because you're trying to lay over multiple frames here. Now you always get a little bit of movement, wind or blow the leaves and that sort of thing, and the software has got to get better and better to try to eliminate some of the ghosting. It'll even allow you to pick one frame to be a reference point. And I don't know if, Kevin, you're going to get into this at all, but you need to be aware of movement in the frame. It can result in ghosting, and sometimes it's a nice thing to add to it from an artistic point of view. It can be very interesting, but it also, may be something you don't want at the end. Next point is check the histograms to make sure you've fully covered the dynamic range, and I think we've mentioned this already. And you should either increase your bracketing to cover the range if you haven't gotten it, or use exposure compensation to adjust your window, moving your entire window either up or down just to make sure you're not clipping at either end. And finally, HDR will, because it increases local contrast, it'll show up dust very readily. So if you're taking a picture of a sunset or something and you might have a little bit of dust in your sensor, it'll look a lot worse with if you do HDR than normal. So one thing I found out the hard way. Just quickly now, you can also do a single exposure HDR. This is a race car at Laguna Seca going through the corkscrew, and I don't know what speed it was going through the corkscrew, but relatively quickly. And this is your normal shot. Now, it wouldn't be practical to try to do 3 or 5 exposures with this, and just because the car is moving too quickly. And so, what I have done is in Lightroom, I've created virtual copies of the initial picture, and then I'll change the exposure value of the copies. So copy number 1, I reduce it by a stop, and copy number 2, I'll increase it. And I'll just take these as 3 separate shots, then run them through the software, whether it's Photomatix or whatever, to create a, I don't know, I'll call it a pseudo HDR, but a virtual HDR. As you see here, you see a little more detail in the pavement and the dark areas. It looks like more of an HDR type of image with a contrast and whatnot, but that was done from a single image. Now, I know there are other ways to do it, but I think some of the software will do a single image process, but it's also, if you work with Lightroom, if your workflow includes Lightroom and then into one of the HDR software tools, you can do it by creating virtual copies. And if you shoot RAW, you can usually push it a stop or so either direction. Usually there's enough information there in the RAW file. Okay, last slide here is things to avoid with HDR. Certainly, people get carried away with the color saturation. It can look very unnatural. You can see some color shifts. You need to be aware of ghosting for movement between the frames. You also get haloing from processing, and that's a dead giveaway. And certainly, you can have very dramatic skies with HDR, and it depends on your intent here. Maybe if your intent is just to replicate what you see with your eye, you need to be somewhat conservative. But if you want to make it more of an artistic statement, go for it with the sliders. Do what you want. So that ends my section now, and I guess I'll turn it back over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Before we start, Kevin, let me just say one thing to the people who are listening, because we've got some excellent tips from Stephen Kennedy on a Canon, on George Fletcher on a Canon 6D, and from Renee Kisselbach, and Steve Montalo. So please check the event and get their tips. And the 3 questions now, Kevin, that still need to be answered. Top software, please mention the top 5 to 10 HDR software tools. Noise, I've been having problem with added noise as well as edge artifacts, similar to overlapping halos, but not due to sharpening with my HDR processing. Any suggestions? And also, before blending, is it a good idea to push the lights and darks into the frame? All right, that's it.
Well, I think maybe I'll cover all those. If I don't, then
okay, great.
Try and come back with it later. But
okay.
Yeah, those tips on the page. Actually, the one George Fletcher mentioned that on the newer cameras, he has the 6D, and Canon has allowed for 3, 5, and 7 shots. So just want to point that out there. And then that other tip from Steven is awesome for Canon as well. So if you're shooting Canon, make sure and check that. So what I want to show is a little bit of going into the software side of things. And the question was 5 to 10 software, the top 5 to 10, and there's not 5 to 10. There's a whole bunch of them out there that are mediocre, and there's some freeware out there that they're free programs, and they're probably good, but because they're free, they're harder to use. There's basically 4 options on the software. You've got Nik, which HDR FX Pro, which now you would just buy the entire Nik software plugin, and that is $150 for all of the programs. So that's a really good deal, and I find that Nik is the easiest to use out of them. The other one would be Photomatix, and I also use Photomatix, and I used Photomatix for a long time before I got the Nik plugins, and it's great as well. It is $100, and that one works great. The other one would be Photoshop. Photoshop does not work as well as those two. And the other one, I had it written down and I don't know where it went, but it's Olo Neo or something. And I've heard great things about that one, but I have not tried it, so I'm not qualified to talk about it. So those are the ones that I'd check out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to come right in here into Lightroom, and I'm going to just, I've reduced these down to small file sizes, and I'm just going to show you kind of the basics of what you do in software to get these combined. And I'm not going to go into great detail. If you want some good videos, actually for the Nik HDR FX Pro, if you go back and watch episode 12, we had Dan Hughes from Nik Software, and he came in and he did a great job of explaining that. Okay, so what I've got here is I just went through my photo stream and I found some pictures that I've never processed before, so I went through here, but I bracket most shots that I shoot, so I don't use them. I would say 75% of the time I don't use the bracketed shots, making it into an HDR, but you know, it's a digital camera, we've got memories cheap, might as well take them in case you need them later. So I've got, this is taken at even, so this is what the camera sees and exposes the scene at. Then we've got one that's 2 stops underexposed and 2 spots overexposed. So from Lightroom, what I'm going to do is select all 3 of the photos, right-click, click on Export, and I'm going to go up here to Nik Collection HDR FX Pro 2. And that's just going to open up a dialog box. And this is kind of the settings for it. So there's some main things that you're looking at here. I can't imagine anyone ever wanting not to check the alignment button. Make sure that's checked. Ghost reduction, like I said, I'm not going to go much into it, and I really recommend that you check our episode 12 with Dan if you want some information about ghost reduction, because he goes into that at great detail. But what I usually do is I'm going to come down here, I'm going to hit this magnifying glass, and I'll go over sections, and this isn't Kevin, zooming in.
Yeah,
go ahead.
You're still in the Lightroom window.
Uh-oh. Okay, let me switch it. I must have to. Sorry about that. If I can just do that. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So here I am. Normally this, I clicked on this little magnifying glass here. Normally this zooms in quite a bit, but I've made this a small file so that it'll go quickly. But what I'll do is I'll just go around and I'll check and see if there's any blurring images. I'll look up in the trees and see if the sky's blurred into the trees. If there's cloud movement, I'll look at that. If there is movement, then you'll go ahead and click on the ghost reduction, and then you'll choose which exposure you want to reference it up. And it's kind of just a trial, going through and seeing which one works the best, but it works really well. So I didn't see any in this photo. Everything.
So Kevin, there's one specific question about exactly what you're doing from George Fletcher. He says, what's the best way to reduce haloing between the light and dark, trees against the skies? I'm using Photomax and Lightroom. I also have On One Perfect Effects 7.5.
Okay. In Photomatix, I'll just answer that question real quick. In Photomatix, the only way that I've been able to find it to do it when you have a high contrast between tree leaves and the sky is to really minimize the strength of the HDR effect. In this, you would go ahead and click Ghost Reduction, and I find that this program, the Nik program, works a lot better for that specific problem. So my advice would be either, and I'll show you when I get to, I'm going to actually show Photomatix in here in just a minute, and I'll show you what setting I'm talking about, but maybe download a trial of the Nik and try it and see if it helps your problem out. Okay, so I went ahead and clicked Create HDR. And what I do from that point, this is your photo with the 3 exposures combined, and you've got these presets on the left-hand side. You can just click on the presets, and it will show you what it does. I typically use balanced, deep 1, or deep 2, but there are a lot more in here. Some of them are much better for buildings and things like that, but for general landscape, these 3 work really good. So let's see, I like that one. So let's go ahead and show that one. I'm not going to get too much into these settings, but I want to show the biggest advantage of Nik software versus anyone else, and that is the control points. So I like this. Normally I'm not going to do much with any of the other settings in here. I'm just going to go back into Lightroom and adjust it. But with a control point, I can click on a new control point, and I can come in here, and it gives you all these options. And I might want to increase the structure to make the cloud stand out a little more. And what I really want to do is click on the temperature and warm it up a little bit in that sky. And maybe I should exaggerate it a little bit to make sure everyone can see that. Sometimes it doesn't come across on the Hangouts. You can really see it up there. And then I'm just duplicating this point and moving it around here, making sure I get all of my sky. And I might do the same thing down here in the water. Obviously that's too much, but I'm trying to overdo that. So that's the main benefit, I think, for HDR Effects Pro over Photomatix. Now I'm going to say I'm done here. I'm going to click Save, and it's going to come back into Lightroom. And here's my photo. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Develop module, and I'm going to just do the basic things that I normally would do to a photo to make it look nicer. The one that I really think you need to do is you need to decrease the blacks, and what that does is it puts some of that shadow detail back in there. The photo looks flat when it comes out of HDR software typically, and you want to just kind of make that come back out a little bit. But that's the general principle of it, and you can see before and after, just a couple little tweaks makes the photo look a lot better. Okay, now I'm going to show you one more real quick, and I think I'll just stick with the same photo, and I'm going to show you how I do this in Photomatix. I'm just going to right click, select all 3 of them again, right click, export, and then choose Photomatix Pro. You've got a few different options up here. Now Photomatix, on its ghost reduction, you can have it do it automatically for you, and it does a fairly good job. Most of the time I found that the automatic works. Semi-manual, if you clicked that, it would bring up another box, and you would have to draw circles around the areas where you see ghosting, and that works well as well. So like I said, I don't have any in this one, so I'm going to take that out. Another thing that sometimes helps is to reduce the noise on the underexposed image, and That's for a little darker scenes normally. I don't have any problem with it usually. I like to keep reduce chromatic aberrations selected, and then automatically re-import to Lightroom. So I'll just click Export, and that'll bring up the dialog for Photomatix Pro. And when I use Photomatix, and everyone's a little different on this, Tom might be a little different than me, but I like to keep it really simple. I don't use hardly any of the options in here. Now, on that question about your leaves against the sky, I found about the only way to get rid of that is to reduce the strength and bring that way down. Typically, if I don't have that problem, I like to have the strength up around 80, 90, somewhere in there. So that's one that I will change. And then the other one that I change is I like to click this little button here that says Light Mode. And that just gives you these options. And if you look down here, a minimum, that's going a long ways, way too far. So really the only ones I ever use are high and max, because I want the photos to look realistic. I don't want them to look like this. And there are some photos you may want to go for that unrealistic look, but in a typical scene like this, I'm probably just going to go with max or high. So I'm going to go ahead and click high, and I'm going to ask you real quick, Tom, do you do much more inside of Photomatix?
No, I don't. Matter of fact, I was going to ask you, you have a number of presets in Photomatix, just like we did in the other one. Which are your favorite presets?
I actually don't even use them. Do you?
Oh, I do. I use this smoothing, or sometimes enhanced, or sometimes the default.
Yeah, I just use the default. Which ones are your favorite? The smooth?
One or the other, the smooths, or sometimes the enhanced gives it a little more contrast.
Yeah, that's good. So I think I'm just going to leave it that. I'm going to leave it at high, and my strength at about 82. And I'm just going to click Save and Re-import. And that's going to bring it right back into Lightroom. And in Lightroom, that's where I'm going to just go back into my Develop module and edit the photo. So I'll probably add a little contrast. Because I couldn't go in and do that selective adjustment up here in the sky, there are several ways I can do that. I can go in and I could get an adjustment brush and go brush it in. I'll try here and just reduce the highlights a little more, and as you can see, that brings it out real nicely. And again, I really love to bring the blacks down. It really makes it look like a more three-dimensional photo. So you can see just from a couple adjustments again, it looks much nicer. So let me just show one more here. I'm just going to show so this is the Nik software, and this is the Photomatix, and you can see both of them I think work good. So I don't know that there's a wrong set of software that you can get for this. I will say though that for the $150 with the Nik plugin, you get a whole lot more than just the HDR Effects Pro. So I might recommend that if you're on a budget. If you can swing it, I recommend getting both. I have both. I bought them almost a year and a half apart, so that makes it easier. But I think we've got just a minute. Jim, why don't you share with us the ones that you've done?
Okay. Sure. Let me share the screen, and okay. And I gotta say, Kevin and Tom, those were just amazing. I really loved seeing your work. So here's the first HDR that I did. It's in Zion, and this particular one was 2 images, and it's I call it HDR, but frankly I used Photoshop to overlay the two images and pick the sky and the highlights from one and the foreground from the other image. So my objective was to get one photo that really showed what it looked like in real life. I wasn't trying to exaggerate anything. The clouds lit up and it was just amazing. So here's a 2-image HDR. This was an experiment that I did using HDR Effects Pro, Kevin, and I do my processing in Aperture. This was just to see, what I could do with this very high contrast sunset. This particular one was a 9 exposure HDR.
It looks like you got the hang of it real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. Love that.
Thank you. And then, last but not least, this is a shot from Lower Antelope Canyon, and the neat thing about the slot canyons is it's such a huge dynamic range. If you get any sky, or if you are shooting the slot canyon but you happen to have some rock that's illuminated by the sun, so maybe no direct sky, but if there's daylight shining on the rock, you'll get huge dynamic range. So this one, I decided to try something really unusual and explicitly include a bunch of sky. And I processed this with Photomatix, and this is a 7-image HDR in order to show, the detail on the rock, but also the sky with some very high clouds. And that's it. That's the total of my HDR experience.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's great.
Thanks.
All right. Well, just
great,
real quick, Cara. I really meant to talk about halos, and I didn't. But let me just say real quick that is one of the things that you have to watch out for the most when you're doing HDR, and typically it's going to be, where a light area meets a dark area, and you're going to have a big halo, and you need to really watch out for that. And there's more information out there on that, but the biggest reason that will happen is you're just trying to do too much. So back off a little bit. You want to keep your HDR subtle. You don't want to go crazy on it. So anyway, thanks, Cara.
Great. I have an HDR setting on my camera, and here's what I learned. You must use a tripod if you shake it all. Tom was right about that. And I think Jim saw one of my first one. He goes, "So what are those little lines?" I guess those were halos. But that was because there was no tripod. So you just have to start somewhere. And we hope that we've brought some inspiration for anyone out there who hasn't tried it to at least try it. And you can rent a camera with an HDR camera and try that too. So now we come to the end of our show, where we have the photographers that are our suggested photographers to circle and watch, and we share their photos. And we want to let you know that our next show is going to be October 8th, and we will be having Jeff Sullivan back. And so excited to see how to edit night photography. And so we're going to go right now to Jim, and he will share with us.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with my recommended photographer is Franca Gabler, and she is a photographer based in California. She's been quite active in the landscape photography theme, and if you look at her stream, she has a really diverse set of gorgeous work. Landscapes both in California and Croatia, interestingly, and some cityscapes, seascapes, and just a really great variety. And she does some abstract and impressionist work, color and monochrome. So I hope you'll check her out and drop her a note, say hello, and follow her.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Now we go, Margaret.
My recommended photographer tonight is Brian Wilkins out of Minnesota. And he's kind of unknown on Google+, doesn't have too many followers yet, but he just does some gorgeous landscapes. Here's one. I just love the lights and the reflections, and it's like, I don't know which I like better, the sky or the water. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So he's one that check out his work. I think you'll enjoy it. And he's also a frequent contributor to the landscape photography theme. And I think you have another one there.
You seeing it, Margaret?
No.
Oh, it's a beautiful red flowers and purple flowers and a sunset. We're seeing it.
Okay, well that's an example of his work. So please give him a try. Take a look at his stream, and I think he's going to be a photographer that you'll want to follow.
Good.
There it is. I see it now.
Okay, Cara.
Okay, this is Nicholas Papagalos Jr. from the Phoenix area, and he is just an amazing photographer. We've just finished through the monsoons, and he is so busy. He is the CEO of the PAC Photographers Adventure Club, and they just are always having fun things to do. So you might follow him and then check out, if you're ever coming into the Phoenix area, some of the events that they have. But this was the little bit of light painting on a yucca plant, and the wonderful electrical storm with the traffic. So we got some good action going there. And I think we have one more. Here we have the iconic up by Page, the horseshoe bend, and got some wonderful light going on there with the sky. So again, Nicholas Papagalos Jr., and follow him and check out what he's got going on with the PAC, and maybe you can come to some of their events.
Great. Okay, Kevin.
Okay, this is Tony Phillips, and Tony is a really nice guy. He shares a lot with the landscape photography theme, and he comments on a lot of people's photos, and he takes some great photos as well. So, and I think there's one more. Let's look at that. And that one, that's one of my favorites. I just love that photo. So check him out and follow him so you can see some more.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. Love that.
Okay, Tom.
Okay, for my photographer, I picked Guy Schmickel from Sedona, Arizona, and I had forgotten somebody had chosen him at a previous show. But as I look at his work, one thing I was impressed is just the consistency of of all the great shots. I mean, I'm like many people, get a good shot every so often, but boy, Guy has a whole series of great shots in his page. So I would encourage people to look at his work and follow him. Yeah, here's another one, and I just love the reflection and the colors and the sun on the hills here. So,
Definitely.
again, Guy Schmickel in Arizona.
Thank you. Okay. Back to you, Cara.
Oh, I am. Okay. Are you done there, Jim?
Yes.
Okay, great. It was on freeze for a minute. Okay, so we want to thank everyone for coming, and remember, it's Jeff Sullivan will be editing Night Photography on October 8th at 7 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you contributing to the event. And be sure and go through the comments, because there's a lot of learning tools people shared, and thank you everybody for sharing all those tips right in the comments. And you all have a great week, and we will see you on October 8th. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.